Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. And tonight we're going to be talking about animal care or animal cruelty. And before we get our guests on, I want to tell you a little story. The Speaker of the South African Parliament, Thandi Modise, was allegedly involved in animal cruelty in 2014. When over 50 of her farm animals died of thirst and starvation, and many others had to be put down. 6 years later, she is still to face court over these charges. Sadly, this case cannot be looked at in isolation. It is quite common in the country, but reflects the reality of the ANC leadership's blatant disregard for life. Let's have a quick look at the graphic video taken at Thandi Modise's farm back in 2014. And I have to warn you that it is graphic, so if graphic footage does upset you, please go and do something else for about a minute. Here we go.
The SPCA was called to Thandi Modise's farm in the northwest after receiving a tip-off that animals on the land had been abandoned. What they found shocked them.
It's the worst farmer issue, that the cruelty that I've come across in the 20 years that I've been with the SPCA. It's horrific. We're all at a loss of words.
The SPCA decided to euthanize the remaining pigs on the farm after it was discovered they were cannibalizing the dead pigs. Attempts to dispose of the sheep carcasses by workers brought in after the grisly discovery led to a fire on the farm.
From carcasses that we've seen and confirmation from the vet, it could be 7 days. But the information we have is that the farm has been abandoned like this for 2 weeks. However, we found carcasses strewn around the property, which indicates that it's been going on for much longer than just 2 weeks.
Order.
The chairperson of the National Council of Provinces has owned the property for several years. Modise's associates who were on the farm claim the farm manager left his post to deal with the family emergency, and his interim replacement had disappeared, leaving the farm with no water or electricity and the animals to fend for themselves. Modise did not respond to several requests for an interview.
All right, that gives you a bit of background to some of the things that people are facing in South Africa, or I should say the animals are facing in South Africa. Tonight we're meeting Chloe Roberts and Rob Hutchinson from Dear South Africa. We're going to be discussing the objectives of Dear South Africa, which many of you will get by email, the Enviro Expert Coalition, and the Animal Protection Act. All right, without any further ado, let me get the guests on. Hi, Chloe.
Good evening, Scott. How are you doing?
Excellent, thank you, excellent. I'll just go and get Rob on as well, and then we're ready to rock and roll.
Perfect. Thank you for that. That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Here comes Rob now, I think. Here he is.
Sure.
Hi, Rob.
Hello.
Hey, Rob.
You guys know each other, so I'm not going to introduce you.
Good.
Right. Now, Rob, you've set up the highly successful Dear South Africa letter, which is, I get every week or two with different petitions and stuff like that. Can you introduce Dear South Africa and the Enviro Expert Coalition to those who watch this video? Tell them what it's all about. Just for the record, I have links to your websites down below in the description of this video. And that's the Animal Protection Act and Dear South Africa. Back to you, Rob.
Thanks. Lovely. Thanks, Scott. So Dear South Africa is a public participation network. It's pretty much just a website and organization that promotes and facilitates public participation in any government decision, in the hopes to create solid policy that suits both the public and government's needs. We do this at all levels of government, from municipal through to provincial and through to national, and even in state-owned entities. So we get involved in policy formation, in tariff structuring, in any amendments that have to go out in all sectors. And then in our group, we have what we call expert coalitions, which are essentially lobby groups, which are focused to sectors of governance. And one of them is the Environmental Expert Coalition, which focuses on environmental matters, whether it be animal welfare or and animal rights, as well as the environment and fauna and flora as such. And that's pretty much in a nutshell what we do.
Right. Okay. And have you had much blowback from the politicians because you do this and it causes them a bit of discomfort?
Yeah, yes and no. In some cases, yes, because we expose a lot of questionable policy. I had to choose my words carefully there, but yeah, sometimes a lot of policy goes out. The fact is that any decision that government wants to make has to be put out for public comment for around about 30 days, between 14 and 30 days, depending on which level it is at any government. And that is intended so the public is involved in the policy making. But government tends to hide this, and which is where we kind of step in and inform the public, educate them, and then facilitate that whole process. So in some cases, we help government in formatting proper policy, but in other cases, we also expose a lot of policy that would have been slipped in under the radar. So yeah, the answer is yes and no there.
Right. What has been your biggest success, your campaign that you sent out? What has been your biggest success to date?
Our biggest success, that's pretty easy. I think it's something you're quite involved in as well. It is expropriation without compensation, amending the constitution. On that one alone, which was in, I think the first call was in June 2018, we had 239,000 participants in that campaign.
Wow.
And we don't run petitions. So the difference between what we do in petitions is quite substantial. Petitions, if you can gather a million signatures on a petition, government will still see that as a single submission when it comes to Parliament. Whereas what we do is that every single comment that is made through our system by the public is individually delivered to government, where it's acknowledged and recognized as an individual submission. So we didn't just collect 239 signatures. We actually sent 239,000 submissions through to government on that project.
Now, legally, do they have to read every single one of those?
The law actually dictates that they do. They have to acknowledge and consider every single one of them.
That must have made someone really happy.
Absolutely, yeah. We ran a campaign, I think it was for the city of Cape Town, on one of the drought charges there. And normally they'd get about between 100 and 250 at the most submissions on their calls for comment. On that drought charge, we sent through, I think it was 61,000 individual submissions to the city of Cape Town on that. And they just backed down and they said, no, we can't deal with this. And they abandoned the whole drought charge and tried to hide it. They tried to hide it in another policy, at which point we sent through another 57,000 individual submissions. And eventually they canned the whole thing. So it's the power of public participation is quite immense, and it creates a significant impact. Yeah,
that's how to make friends in high places, huh?
Indeed, yes.
Now, tell us the purpose of the organization.
Well, the organization, like I said, is there to facilitate public participation in the hopes to form strong policy. But it's our philosophy is definitely that prevention is better than cure, and it all stems from the fact that any societal problems are generally brought about because of inadequate legislation, missing legislation, or overbearing legislation. So it all boils down to a legislative issue. So we scan the documents, we scan the government gazettes, the local gazettes, and then we find any policy that needs to be amended. Just looking at find any policy that needs
Look
to
at
be
the tail.
Sorry, my cat would like to join us.
Nothing like live TV, is it? Carry on, Rob.
So I scan through all the government gazettes and we find policy that goes out for calls for comment, like government has to do, and we just facilitate that whole process. We also record all the public participation and keep a strong report and a strong legal record of it all, so that government can't turn around and say, well, we didn't have any participation on this, or the public said this, and in fact we have the evidence that the public said the opposite. Before, government used to keep all of that information, and then you'd have to go through a whole legal process and pay applications to get that information from them. Now we sit in between government and the public, and we keep a record of all of that, which forms a great foundation for any legal challenge that has to happen at a later stage, should government implement a policy that doesn't follow what the public wants, or which is totally against what the public needs. That's pretty much it in a nutshell what we do.
Right.
Dear South Africa is more reactive in addressing and responding to government calls for comment, whereas our expert coalitions are more proactive in taking a stance and helping address inadequate, missing, or overbearing policy within those sectors.
Right. Okay, I'm just going to quickly address the side chat and people watching. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think you're going to find the discussion very, very interesting and very relevant. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed if you haven't already done so. We have live streams most nights on the Loving Life channel. And please like this video or live stream. And thanks to all the moderators for the great work that you're doing. All right, now, before we go over to you, Chloe, I do have to make an observation. You know, in Parliament, when someone speaks, you got that person in the corner who's sort of using sign language to show deaf people how to, or what has been said. Well, your cat had its tail in the corner there on live TV, and it was wagging. You know, when a cat's tail wags, it means it's cross. And I think it's cross because you were ignoring him or her.
Yes, I can tell you honestly, Scott, I sit here day in, day out, and he doesn't come onto my table. But it is now, because we're all sitting here on camera, that he's going to join us.
Animals know their timing, don't they? Now, Chloe, this Fairview incident, I actually had a live stream where I spoke to one of the trainers, and I spoke to one of the security guys who were involved with it. But based on the media detail, tell us what your views are on this whole thing that happened at Fairview.
Thanks, Scott. So I think obviously a few of the viewers and followers will understand sort of more or less what happened there. But maybe just for those that don't, what happened last week, Thursday, was quite a violent protest that erupted at Fairview Racecourse, which is situated in Port Elizabeth area, so that's on the coast. And the actual issue had started already a few months ago. From February, there was the ringleader, if you'll say, he was actually called out for stabbing a horse in the stable block, which is quite a serious offense. So within that, there's a lot of emotion just on that level. But what had happened is he had come back, and I believe there was a dispute about finances. I think it was UIF, to be more specific. And he had come through to the racing yard, and they came armed with sort of knob kerries, pangas, other, sticks as well. So they came across with quite an aggressive approach as a protesting group. And within that, they then proceeded through the stable yard to open the doors and let the horses out. Further to that, obviously we weren't at the event at the time, but nobody in their right mind that works with horses will know that that's a good idea, and especially race horses. They are quite sensitive animals when they're fed quite high diet, high protein, so it's high energy. So in letting that horse out, you're causing detrimental damage beyond what they can even consider. And unfortunately, within that, there were a number of horses that were injured, ranging from minor scrapes to some that had quite serious incisions. And that we don't know necessarily. I haven't seen the vet reports, but whether that was caused from pangas or if it was just other objects. But within that as well, there was a fatality of a horse. I'm sure you touched on it in your other chat, Mark the Doorman, which is very unfortunate. And that we also just want to share condolences for that, because that is very tragic. But I think in terms of our views on this, we've obviously looked at it from a few different angles. But the long and the short is that behavior is not acceptable. I know that within the equestrian industry and the racing, there was a massive uproar about this, and rightfully so, because any, stable hand or groom that works with our animals, we entrust them that they're going to look after them, as well as we would, or if not better. And, you pay this person every month. They also get, I think they get a share of the earnings as well if their horses do well in the races. So in terms of reimbursing and ensuring that the staff are looked after, that element does exist. And I think in terms of this type of behavior, for one person as the ringleader to sort of go astray and to then have as many as 150 or 200 other followers in suits from other portions of the stable yard, it's quite concerning, because how far does this issue extend? And it's malicious behavior. It's not just a little bit of, unrest about a financial gain or something to that degree. So in the long and the short, we've also seen it from the other side, where there was actually a couple of tweets going out on Twitter, where they were saying that the horses are being treated better than the people are. And it's unfortunate, firstly, that people view it that way, but it does need to be acknowledged that you cannot compare the requirements of a horse or the needs of a horse to a needs of a person. That comparison is vastly different. And I think in terms of what happened here, with that understanding or that perception, is if you had to ask basic questions, does either side have access to food, water, and shelter? The answer would be yes. The only difference is that a groom or stable hand would be paid or remunerated so that they could ensure that for themselves. And they are sufficiently remunerated to be able to do that. Whereas if you then go and extend it, to say, does a groom may need other, like a long list of other things, whereas a horse, they don't require the cars or internet or, things like that. So it was quite actually sad to see that positioning was coming through. And although it's not to be discarded, it is heard. I think there's a big gap in the animal perception of how they are treated. And the racing industry is a very costly exercise. To get a horse to a racetrack, Mark the Doorman, just as an example, was, I think, sold for 300,000 Rand, and that was before he went into any training.
And that's the one that died.
So, yes. So I think, looking at it from that perspective, they're not cheap animals to keep with upkeep. And from our side, we feel that more needs to be done, because this event or this protest shouldn't have gotten to this point.
Yeah.
If this had already been starting Tuesday on a small scale, as we understand it, I think it had started, the waves were going from Tuesday into Wednesday, and then Thursday is when all hell broke loose.
Yeah.
But that should have already been dealt with on the Tuesday, if not the Wednesday, to avoid the Thursday incident from transpiring.
Well, there's so many repercussions about what happened. I believe on the Thursday, the police literally stood aside and let all these guys onto the private property, which is just wrong. And also, I believe that some of the groomsmen who were still being employed by various trainers actually went and joined the protesters and chased the horses around, which again is just incredibly bad behavior when you think they're supposed to be caring for horses. I also understand that Yvette and her partner, who is actually one of the horse owners, has, as a result of this, decided they are migrating out of South Africa. They've just had enough, and one can understand that. The thing that disturbs me the most, and these are pretty authentic claims, is that following this horrific incident, the Oppenheimer family got involved and insisted that the media drop everything and just don't say anything, and they warned the Fairview race course that they should just zip their lips and not say anything, because and they were doing this obviously because they're involved in the horse racing industry, and it didn't make them look good. But that kind of getting involved and shutting up the discussion was something that really pissed me off, to be quite frank. Okay, now, well, that's just my perspective on this, guys. I just I find it absolutely horrifying what happened. I mean, horses are such beautiful animals. Okay, now I'm going to put this question to both of you. Tell us the purpose of the Animals Protection Act. Who would like to go first on this?
Okay, I'll give it a shot there, so we can
okay,
get something out of it. Okay, so the Animals Protection Act it's quite an extensive piece of legislation, which was, I think, formulated in in the 1960s originally, and it's been amended several times since then. It's quite extensive in what it proposes to do in actually protecting animals, mostly animals in captivity, and a few other extremities outside of that. However, it does fall short in quite a few areas where it doesn't actually specify exactly what type of animals should be protected and how they should be protected and so on. And one of the major areas where I personally noticed where it actually does fall short quite seriously is animals under state control, where they seem to be exempt from a lot of rules. And when I say animals in state control, I mean animals within zoos as well, because that is a state facility generally. So I think a while ago we had an incident where an elephant got injured at the Johannesburg Zoo. I'm a bit fuzzy on the actual details of what happened there. But the SPCA tried to step in, and there was literally nothing they could do because it was a state facility. There's no clear law on how animals should be protected within state facilities. And it seems to be a rather outdated piece of legislation there. That also goes towards how horses are treated in police custody. There's a whole controversy around that as well. And basically, when an external organization like the SPCA or us try to step in, there's literally nothing we can do. So there are areas where it needs to be amended. And that is up to us to push from civil society and try to do our best there, get government involved, show them what's wrong, and push forward to have things amended to actually protect animals on a much deeper level. The other problem arises around the enforcement of the certain acts and the certain regulations within the Animal Protection Act. And quite frankly, it's disastrous. It really is disastrous. There seems to be no will to actually enforce legislation that already exists to protect these animals. So, we've got to go beyond just the Animals Protection Act and actually look at the bodies who are actually supposed to be enforcing those laws and make sure that they're actually doing an adequate job to protect our animals. And that extends to domestic and wildlife and everything else. There just seems to be no will here to actually do it. And there's various social factors that come into play when you try to figure out the reasons behind that. The fine, there are fines associated in the Animal Protection Act. So they cover abuse of animals, and they're pretty extensive. I think it's up to 4,000 Rand per any act, or an imprisonment of up to 12 months for animal abuse. But you've got to ask yourself, is that enough? Is the 4,000 Rand seems pretty minor, right, when you see some of the horrific stuff that actually does go on. So there again, we need to bring that kind of legislation up to date with more appropriate fines and sentences. And that's about as much as I can think. I'm sure Chloe knows a lot more than I do.
Okay, before I hand over to Chloe, I just want to pick up a point that you made there, Rob. And that point is regarding, the actual penalty if someone does abuse animals. Now, before I got you guys on, I told the story of Thandi Modise, who in 2014 famously neglected her farm animals, and 50 of them died and the rest had to be euthanized. And the SPCA went in there and said, we're going to lay charges. Now, it's 2020, 6 years later, and she is yet to actually face court over those charges. I mean, if this had just been an average person, let's say it had been a white farmer, I reckon that case would have been heard in 3 months. How do we fix this broken judicial system? Because it's all very well having these laws in place, but if senior members of parliament, and let's remember Tandisi Modise is the Speaker of the Parliament in South Africa, if they are able to get away with it because they obviously know people in the right places, doesn't that make a mockery of the whole judicial system?
It definitely does, but I think that is without question. It goes even further than that. When our Human Rights Council actually says that the law applies differently to different people, then you know for sure that there's something wrong in this country. And we have to get beyond that whole situation and actually enforce accountability. But it's got to take one step backwards, in my opinion. We've got to prevent these acts from happening in the first place. That comes with a sort of a reform of society, and especially around animals. If you respect animals, then naturally you will respect humans,
right.
And it starts with respecting yourself. So we've got to shift our whole society needs to reform on a sort of cultural and emotional level before we can actually apply the law or get the law involved. I'll go right back to what I said in the beginning there. Prevention is definitely better than cure. There's no point in enforcing putting people in jail or imposing prison sentences or massive fines on an individual, because it's not going to take the damage away. It's not going to bring those 50 animals. It's not going to bring their lives back. There's no law that can do that. So what we should be focusing on is preventing that kind of thing from happening in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. Now, sorry, Chloe, let's go over to you, discussing the purpose of the Animals Protection Act.
Thanks, Scott. I just want to say on the backside of Rob's answer there, I think that's a really valid point. And just to resonate with that in terms of prevention is always better than cure. And within the existing legislation that we've got, there's a lot of pieces where you read through it on paper and you think, yeah, this makes sense, and yeah, this falls into part with that, and we shouldn't allow cruelty to animals, and you can encompass that in its little box and go, I agree. Yeah. And then you see exactly like that case where it's now come out into the media, we're 6 years later and we're still pending an outcome, and you kind of want to ask yourself, but where is that break off point? And in terms of all of us sitting in different positions in society, that shouldn't, if something is wrong, it's wrong. It doesn't really matter further than that, and that shouldn't be categorized like that as well. So I think just to come back on the Animal Protection Act, the main sort of, if one wants to encapsulate that, it needs to amend and it must sort of cultivate all those laws that sit in and regulations that sit under that act. There's a lot that goes into it, but I do agree with Rob that there's not the regulation is not strict enough. In my personal humble view, I don't know if one can say that would somebody be rehabilitatable if they had to now, go and starve animals and sort of feel no remorse from it. Is the 12 months enough? Is the 4,000 Rand enough?
Yeah.
I really have to echo what Rob said there, because in my view, 4,000 Rand 10 years ago or 20 years ago and what it is today, it just sort of moves down on the scale.
Well, for a member of parliament, it's nothing.
Exactly. That's also, that's valid. 4,000 Rand is, we've seen some of the bills that get exposed at the restaurants, which is considerably more than 4,000 Rand.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the Animal Protection Act, it's formed a lot of its purpose in majority, the 80-20 rule, but there are a lot of drop-off points. And I think, with NSPCA as well, there's a lot of amendments that have come through. It's, through the years, it has been a long piece of standing legislation. But I think also in terms of a gap that's been identified is that, if you were to have now somebody that committed this offense and they've been taken up for cruelty to animals. Where does that information live? How do you, as the next potential employer, go and see, okay, but I see that you were abusing A, B, or C? And that is a massive sort of misfortune that we can offer any employer in this country, no matter what, because if they need to work with animals, be it a pet store, be it a stable yard, no matter where it is. And similarly with children, if one needs to take the compassion element into it, you wouldn't treat the animal any differently to the way you would treat the child. The fact that there is no central repository makes it very difficult to know what has this person been up to. Can you actually trust them? And a lot of it, I was actually saying to Rob in a personal capacity that a lot of these staff will end up moving just very small shifts with people amongst people that they know, because you trust and you go on the word, okay, I can hire this staff member. So similarly at, Fairview, for example, a lot of those staff members are probably recommended or have been around for 20 odd years or 15 years, whatever it might be. So as much as it also becomes, working with animals, a lot of it becomes a bit like this family type of setup as well. And I think we need to focus on making sure that if there are break-off points, that they are not just highly publicized, but they're constantly accessible in whichever means possible. And we don't have that at present. So that is something, that I think on the animals protection side that we could start looking to implement, in a different sort of avenue that we can try and redirect this. Because as much as well on the state-owned animals, if you now sit with your SAPS members, or they maybe haven't been equipped with knowledge necessarily, sometimes it's partially given, and there could be a little bit of ignorance that's playing a role in mishandling, but there could also be negligence just taking place. But that then needs to be identified and corrected. It can't just be identified and left at that point. And whether it is a educational program of some sort, or a sentence if it was outright cruelty, there needs to be different levels to handle the different scenarios. And the Animal Protection Act has got those different scenarios, but not necessarily the corrective measures.
Right. Okay. Well, there's one question I have for you, which is really the elephant in the room. You look at the way the dogs are treated in the townships. I mean, I've seen so many videos of these dogs, and you can see they haven't had a meal in days. I mean, they're just skin and bone. They're abused. How do you deal with that situation? Because it's happening all over South Africa.
It is very right, Scott. It's a rife problem actually here, and a lot of the dogs are not even on the correct diets. They may be eating milli meal or something like that to subsidize for dog pellets. And I think in a sense, the community is not necessarily, from a bread line point of view, funds to go towards dog food.
Yeah, they don't
it's not necessarily accessible. Yeah. It does become an affordability problem, and then it's dewormer and but I think in terms of that issue that we face, a lot of the private organizations have actually stepped up and done a huge deal, and like a great effort over the past few years to try and combat that. Although I don't, they deal with this every day, they're still having to deal with it further and further. And a lot of organizations have tried to look at also implementing educational programs to try and educate the people in the townships.
Right.
Because I think that does play a role. But I do think that if we had to also have state vets that can reach, veterinary care is very expensive in this country as well, and they can't afford pet insurance or the likes. That's way beyond in another segment altogether. So, I think if we had to sort of meet the middle ground between veterinary care, the food, things like that, and education, I think the animals would have a better chance to try and, live in an environment where they're with their family, but they're eating the right things and they're being checked up regularly, because it's also, it sort of goes into sterilizations as well. And a lot of organizations have personally funded or privately funded those sterilizations to try and help stop overspreading animals where there's not enough food or things like that, because it does lead to animal cruelty at the end of it if that animal's starving or dehydrated or in pain from a wound or something like that.
Right. Okay. Now, I guess I'll pose this question to Rob first again, just so we sort of keep it going ping pong. If I can
Sounds
call
good.
it
Good
that. Rob, what are the desired outcomes from this campaign?
I'd say definitely an amendment to the legislation, and possibly extending beyond just the Animal Protection Act, including whatever the public feels is missing from it. From our side, we'd like to see maybe background checks placed on people who work with animals. That'd be a great priority. So, before you hire someone to take care of a horse, for instance, their background, their history, and so on, their mental state, and so on. Almost like you would do a background check on a childminder or a caregiver or teachers for that matter. Animals are granted as rights. They are considered as sentient beings in South Africa, yet they're not treated and as such. So, we need to definitely amend the legislation there. And perhaps Chloe touched on that as well, is a public database or a register of previous animal offenders, much in the same way we have publicly available lists of sex offenders. Exactly right. Do you want those kind of people around in your neighborhood or living in your complex or working with your horses and so on? Because there's just no way to know their history and such. There's a lot of stuff there, but I'd say the main amendment there, or the main objective, would be to amend the legislation to be more vigorous in its approach, and definitely enforceable, realistically enforceable.
Right. Now, do you think that there's a slight inequity here when it comes to fines? I mean, we talked about the 4,000 Rand fine. That would be a lot of money to someone in a township, but to a member of parliament, it just means nothing. Do you think that, and I know this is the same around the world, but do you think that there should be almost like a scale? If someone's earning, let's say, 1 million Rand a month, then it's not 4,000 Rand, it's 400,000 Rand or something like that actually makes it hurt. Because for people with a lot of money, it doesn't hurt.
Well, absolutely. I think it is applied that way already. Because the fine doesn't, although the legislation doesn't say it is a fine of 4,000 Rand, it says a fine not exceeding 4,000 Rand. So it could be from 50 Rand to a maximum of 4,000 Rand. What we need to do is lift that ceiling
up a lot
to a much higher. Yeah. And then it's up to the discretion of the judge at that time to assess the financial situation of the person on trial, and then apply the law adequately to that circumstance.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say it definitely should be a fine. I'm actually reading it here on my screen there. A fine not exceeding 4,000 Rand or imprisonment for a period not exceeding 12 months. That definitely needs to change. In my opinion, that should be, well, let's look at the tax laws as an example. If you don't pay tax and you avoid tax and are convicted of that, the fines are astronomical, up to 1 million Rand. In some environmental legislation, especially on greenhouse gas emissions, you have a fine of up to 10 million Rand in some instances.
Wow.
So what's the difference there? So there's plenty scope and plenty leeway to increase that considerably, and it should be done without a doubt.
Chloe, over to you. The desired outcomes from the campaign.
Thanks. You make me nervous having over to you. I feel like you're expecting something grand, and I can't fill Rob's shoes.
You got the most beautiful
So,
smile, and I'm sure everybody watching is enjoying it.
oh, thanks for that. So I think, Scott, from this campaign, this is obviously a matter as well close to our hearts. And from our side, the first prize would be to see an amendment in the legislation. I think more to that, it's very difficult to really make a difference going forwards. And, based on, if you look at, Rob's philosophy with legislation either missing or outdated, or this definitely falls into that category. So I think if we could see the changes that we put forward being implemented and accepted and supported by public, I think that would really be first prize. And obviously, from that, we would like to see the implementation of those amendments to see a reduction in the cruelty across the board. And whether we can increase those fines and penalties, it needs to be something where it's not just a slap on the wrist. It must be, if you are misbehaving in some or another way, it must be an ouchie that you're not going to go back and do it in a hurry, or before you might just think twice before you go and do it. I think that would be the best possible outcome. And obviously, going forwards, this is something I think in terms of animal cruelty, it's a lot of what we see around the world. It's not just here. And a lot of it is also, animals are just sort of, we get the segment or the section that love animals and will pamper them, that they get Woolies chicken for dinner every night. And then you get the other end of the spectrum where it's just a dog, or it's just there's a lot of disregard for its living right. So I think if we can tighten up and see those changes, that would be first prize.
Right. Now, I just want to steer us back to Fairview for a second. But before I hand over to you to discuss that, Chloe, what I found extraordinary was that, as I said, on the Thursday, the police literally stood aside and let all the protesters go through, and we saw what happened with the horses. Now, when the local community, sent out social media saying that, hey guys, we're going to have a protest on Fairview Racecourse about what happened, the police stepped in and said, no, you're not. We're not going to allow it. If you do it, we're going to arrest you. Remembering that the Fairview Racecourse is a private property. So they had no right to actually say that they would be arresting them on private property. It comes back to the inequity in the law, and Rob, you touched on it with the South African Human Rights Commission. There seems to be this prejudicial attitude towards the minority groups in general compared to the rest of South Africa. And I think that is very, very concerning, and it goes down to the legislation we're talking about here, because there seems to be two sets of rules. So let me ask you this question, Chloe. Why did legislation fail the horses and abiding staff during the protest?
So I think, in short, the answer is that the legislation should not have failed the horses. We've got all of the right parameters in place that could have avoided this and dealt with the actions thereof. The problem that came from the Fairview incident was the implementation of that legislation. And exactly what you've mentioned there is that that property it's a private property. So just in itself, never mind, if you're not thinking your mind of how the event would transpire, one would have to enter the property first. That in itself, step one, was trespassing.
Exactly.
That should have been dealt with, definitely. And it's not that legislation doesn't exist to cover that. It does. It just was not implemented. And that if it had already been dealt with, they wouldn't even got to the stable block. But the other side of it is that, now you think, okay, they're progressing through the property and they're now making their way to the stable yard. That protest was not legal either. So that is the second standoff point. But prior to them even doing any damage, that shouldn't have been permitted. And authorities, racing authorities, the labor authorities, there's multiple channels that could have dealt with it and didn't. They kind of, from the Tuesday already, this should have been a discussion point. So there was already 2 points where the animals were failed as a result of non-implementation. Then further to that, they've now, now you can imagine they're in the yard, they start opening up stable doors. That is also, animals, those animals don't belong to them. They don't have any right to be interfering there, and can be held liable for the fees, costs, that have been accrued as a result of their negligence. And in terms of, I know that a lot of stable yards also have their own indemnities and things like that. But as a staff worker, I mean, if you're coming in, that was your primary activity was, you were needing to care for the animal. And over and above this ringleader, if you look at a protest, the general triangle of it is that you have your ringleader that takes the mob. And they, especially if it's a violent mob, they will, take charge from that person. That ringleader apparently already had a warrant out for his arrest because he stabbed one of the horses in February. So that was another point where legislation stands, but again, it wasn't implemented. And if you had maybe taken the ringleader out a lot earlier, would the protest have been a lot milder, or would it have even happened at all? That was another point that was coming through quite strongly, and I think that's something we need to focus on as well, because if the justice system is there but not being implemented, then that equity or inequity rather, shouldn't be put to a race or a economic background or anything of that sort. It means it's there, but it's our actual enforcement that's then failing. And the additional sort of over and above point to this is all of those animals that were injured. That was a negligent harm, that wasn't at all done by accident, or any of those injuries was as a direct result of them sort of fleeing for what they thought they needed to run away from. And that is animal cruelty through and through. And so not only were there criminal charges that can be applied in terms of trespassing, but there were animal cruelty. And if you think of that, that was actually right at the end. So there was a layer of legislation, or multiple layers, that could have, should have, and would have been enforced if it was, I think, at the right, whatever the mood or the reasoning was from SAPS that day, they should have acted on those. And I think over and above, just the cruelty and the trespassing, there was another angle where they then got violent to the point that they were touching on gender-based violence. And I believe that there were also, sexual intimidations raised and things of that nature. So, and that has its own, recourse as well. So there were multiple angles, and to hear that only one person got arrested and was let out on bail out of those 200 people, and that wasn't even the person that had the warrant out for his arrest, is dismal to say the least. And how do you now, those animals standing there, I don't blame those trainers for moving the horses, because in moving them, they've also actually destroyed all the job opportunities.
Yeah, exactly.
Not with intent, but because of the safety of the animals. So, those people that had jobs a week ago, what are they going to do a month from now? And that was something I don't think that they thought of, but I do, I would support if that was my, me in those shoes, I also would have said, oh, my horses are not safe, let me rather move them. Because it's a lot of money that goes into this, and the well-being is very important. So I think they were failed on a few levels, but not due to legislation not being in place. There are some gaps, no doubt, but I think a lot of it was just non-implementation that was the problem.
Yeah, well, I want to add a couple of points to that. The first one is that the guy who was fired in February, he actually had a restraining order on him. He wasn't even, he actually had a in-place restraining order that he couldn't come onto the property. Now, that's a further legal aspect, and he wasn't even arrested. And he was leading the riot. I mean, that just shows how completely broken the judicial system is in South Africa. Now,
sure.
Yeah, and the other thing that I was just thinking about is that when they left there, there was no attempt to try and apprehend them for what they'd done. They were just let go. It's just totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
Now, Rob, is there something you'd like to add to this discussion on that particular issue?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's what. While we were talking there, I just thought, is there no accountability in South Africa here? And well, it's a rhetorical question. We know there isn't. But yeah, should there not be other laws in place that hold officials accountable? Should they not act
Yes,
in
exactly.
line with legislation? Yeah,
Exactly.
maybe that's something that we should be campaigning for in South Africa, because that'll change the judicial landscape overnight. If in a clear-cut case like that, where there was a restraining order and the police officers didn't act in the way that the law compels them to, surely there's some action we can take against those police officers, because they actually broke their oath of. I'm sure that they've
Upholding
taken
the
an
law.
oath to uphold the Constitution. Yeah, and it's actually in the Constitution
Yeah.
that they're supposed to perform their constitutional duties, and one of them is to uphold the law and enforce the law. Surely there's some recourse that we can seek there. Maybe that's a part of this campaign that we should actually put in place as well. Or
I
maybe
think
it's
that's
a
a great
secondary
idea.
campaign.
Hold the people who are in position of authority to account.
Accountable. There's laws around if you know that a crime has been committed or an act of corruption has taken place and you don't report it, you are actually accountable
Yes, you are.
for
You're an
that,
accessory to the
that,
crime.
that law. So surely we can extend on that and say, if you see a blatant crime has been committed there and or legislation hasn't been enacted and you're a police officer, you are accountable for that exact crime. Maybe we can look at something. I'd love to implement that.
I think that's a fantastic idea. And Wolfie said here in the side chat, these grooms brought it upon themselves. Like she said, the attackers don't think. They never think before acting. And I actually have an expression I use in my videos, and it's called the L factor. And it's what I'm referring to is the logic factor. That there seems to be a complete disconnect between people's actions and what's going to come out because of their actions. They just don't seem to be able to perceive exactly what you were talking about there, Chloe, would be happening, that they would lose their jobs. It's such an incredible disconnect, and it goes all the way up to the president and his ministers. The L factor is completely missing in Parliament. It's crazy, some of the stuff they do. Look at the cigarettes and the banning alcohol and stuff like that. I mean, just ridiculous. Anyway, I'll be a bit of a rant here.
Let's absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, let's continue. Now you're going to be doing this launch announcement and the objectives of the animal protection campaign. Rob, do you want to speak to that? What's going to happen? How are you going to do this?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to run a public participation campaign. We've got a legal team looking at amending legislation as it is. Like I mentioned earlier on, not just the Animals Protection Act, but any related legislation that goes alongside it, especially when it comes to the caring of animals and the welfare of those animals. And the first part of that will be identifying the missing pieces of legislation, what needs to be amended, and so on. And then we'll run a public participation campaign, present our version of the amendment, and then invite public to actually provide their input in case we've missed something, in case we've got something wrong, and help us actually form this into a solid piece of legislation that we can then take to the parliamentary committee and present it to them, and then hopefully they'll discuss it among themselves and then present it to Parliament, and actually then get the laws changed in favor of protecting animals to a much stronger degree. So that'll be it's in a nutshell. We hope to launch this pretty soon. hoping by end of this week. Currently, there's a bill in Parliament right now presented by, I think it's a member of the ACDP, Mr. Stephen Swart, am I correct? Mr. Stephen Swart, MP, and that addresses one aspect of the Animals Protection Act, and that is around animal testing for cosmetics. So if we can tag along onto that, or maybe present an addendum to that, which extends his approach a lot more, it'll make life a hell of a lot easier for us all. And we've actually got that running on our website right now, asking people to participate in that and comment and see what needs to be added. But my feeling is we're going to have to present our own legislation and then present it to the committee and then through to Parliament, which is good because, generally when you want to amend legislation, it's done through a private member's bill, which is presented by an opposition member, an MP from an opposition party. And, of course, they're going to get shot down because there's ANC holds a majority in Parliament and they don't want to bow down to any opposition party. So our approach is slightly different. We go through the parliamentary committees and form a good relationship with the committee, and the chairperson of those various committees is generally an ANC member of Parliament who wants to look good in Parliament. So we give him the opportunity to look good in Parliament by saying, here's a wonderful piece of legislation, why don't you present it and then make yourself look good. So it's ANC presenting to ANC, so the chances of success are far greater than an opposition party going in. So and it's worked for us so far.
Okay.
So
now,
we're definitely going to take advantage of that again.
but before passing this question over to you, Chloe, have you spoken to the SPCA about this legislation? Because if in need, I can put you in direct contact with Meg Wilson and Grace. We actually had a fiery discussion with Meg Wilson about a week ago over another subject, and we now have direct contact with them. So if you if you're looking for contacts in the SPCA, we're happy to put you in touch with them.
Thank you for that, Scott. I
Back
think
to you, Chloe.
we've actually shown, thanks, Scott. We've previously engaged with NSPCA actually on one of the other campaigns that we were running on the Draft Meat Safety Act and a couple of other discussions there. But yes, it would be interesting if we said that we've got the introduction from you if you've had a fiery discussion.
But believe me, I wasn't the cause of the fiery discussion. We just had. Look, I'm not going to go there. But it was a very interesting subject and still unresolved. But okay, now obviously, if you're going to be launching this campaign, you're going to need money, aren't you? So how are you going to be raising funds for financing all this, Rob?
Again, on our website, it's just a simple form on the campaign there. People can do a monthly donation or a once-off, whichever suits them and their budget better. And whatever you can. The money won't be going towards our salaries as such. Definitely not. The money will be used for legal fees because it's going to take a lot to formulate this legislation and so on. And we're actually going to ring fence every single donation that comes in for this. So it's dedicated to that. It'd be for legal fees and for any other associated costs that go to that. Straight on our website, on dearsouthafrica.co.za, find the campaign and there's a donate button there, and you can do credit card, direct debits, debit orders, even SnapScan, whatever you want, and it'll be greatly appreciated. Anything from 10 Rand to whatever your heart desires.
R1 million would be good. If you're listening, Mrs. Oppenheimer, now's your chance.
Yeah, look, like I said, the amount, whatever money does come in, will be absolutely ring fenced for this campaign. If we raise too much money, more than we need, then we'll donate it to SPCA or horse care facility or whatever else, what else needs to be. And we'll let the public decide on that as well. We'll put a couple of options out there and let the public actually decide where the excess funds will go.
Okay. And just for the record, the link to your website is directly below this video in the description, so people can actually click on that and go straight to your... That's it. That's it. You got the hand movement right. No. Okay, Chloe, would you like to talk about the funding aspect?
I think, Scott, maybe just within that, Rob's touched on a lot of the points there that are important. I think maybe just to also unpack a little bit, just a small portion on the funding, is that I think within these procedures, if one is not in the day-to-day of it, it's very difficult to understand. But one can understand, I think, that in terms of bite-sized pieces, every little legal opinion that goes towards the campaign, things like that, that all accumulates in the back end. But there's a lot more reward that comes from every little bite-sized piece in the long run,
Right.
In terms of just, I know sometimes you see but why should I click donate, or what difference will it make, or what difference will I make? I think what's different here with Dear South Africa is that not only do you get to donate, but you get to form part of the say going forwards. And that's actually quite a special thing in itself. Not many other organizations have been able to offer that. And, I think with Dear South Africa, the name in itself says it all. And so I think just to echo on that, we'd really appreciate any funding that does go towards this campaign. It will help us to help the animals, which also helps the public that support this cause in a greater sense of everything.
And I think I can say with a fair degree of certainty, Rob, that Open Society Foundation is not one of your benefactors.
Definitely not.
Okay, I'm pleased you just clarified
George
that.
George Soros is not a fan.
Okay, now let's move on to the process of how the public or other organizations can get involved in this campaign. I'll start again with Rob. Rob?
Well, we believe in collaboration, without a doubt, whether it's with public or individuals, corporates, or other organizations. We don't believe that civil society acts as in silos. It's not the way to go. That's more for politics. And there should be no competition in civil society. So we welcome any organization that wants to join with us, wants to support us, or just wants to hold hands as such in a coordinated movement. They can just contact myself or Chloe at Dear South Africa or Environmental Expert Coalition, and join forces, support us, and we'll support you. It's what it's about.
Yeah. Chloe, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. So just maybe to separate out between a member of the public and other organizations. As a member of the public, by sharing the link, by talking about it within your fellow communities or at your local brides, that helps a lot just to get awareness onto these campaigns. I think a lot of it is, you can reach out through Facebook or social media and the likes, but it does help to have that sort of one-on-one discussion. Just to make people aware. It's not necessarily that everyone's going to agree and feel the same way, and that's exactly why Rob has carefully constructed the form that you can say, yes, I do, not fully, or no, I don't.
Right.
So we just encourage that, as a member of the public, just to distribute and discuss, matters that are obviously of interest or applicable to you, to share that with fellow friends and family or colleagues. And then on the organization side, so as Rob has nicely mentioned there, that we collaborate. It's not about one being ahead of the other or anything of that nature. We hold open discussions and we take suggestions as well, because, you can't always think of everything from all angles. And some other organizations maybe deal with maybe more harsh realities than us on a daily basis, which we respect and appreciate. So for that, just to collaborate on that, those different pieces of information is quite important to us. So our inboxes are always open, and we're always ready to reply, and it's not to shut anybody out or anything. So from either side, we appreciate distributing and collaborating and engaging.
Right. Okay, now I'm just going to address the people watching on the side chat. Guys, if you have any questions, please throw them into the side chat. I do have one question from Fiona Timms that I've picked up. I might have missed others. I got rather engrossed in what we were talking about. Fiona has said, a question to the panel from me. Can they address the Mooti factor, please? And I guess what she's talking about there, and she says continued. I'm sorry, Fiona, I forgot I didn't see the other half of your question, but I think we got most of it in there. So I think what she's talking about is how animals are used for Mooti and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. That brings horrific images into my mind. But yeah, I think that is quite necessary as well. It's a tender subject though, because you've got to respect traditional beliefs and so on. And the Constitution does state that you have freedom of religion and religious practices and so on, but within the ambit of the law. So again, there it would be determined by the Animals Protection Act again, and to what the limitations within that are. So again, we have to dissect it to make sure there's nothing missing. You can't hack off pieces of animals and use them as Mooti. Sorry to be graphic, but that is what happens.
Yeah.
And it'll be again down to getting our amendment or our proposal of an amendment properly and strong enough to actually cater for all those areas. And that's a great example. That's something we didn't even think of. So well done for actually suggesting that, because that is definitely an area that needs to be included in our amendment.
Right. Okay. I don't see any further questions. I think we've pretty well covered. Yeah. Is there anything we haven't covered, Rob, that you'd like to raise at this point, or you, Chloe?
I'm great, go Chloe.
Chloe, over to you.
Thank you. I think we've covered more or less everything in a nutshell from the Fairview side and the Animal Protection Act.
Right.
I know that we do have a couple of other current campaigns that are running at the moment, and it just maybe stretches on other sides as well. Things like 5G towers. There is a wider umbrella. So I think maybe just to advise the public and followers as well of that, because often exactly like that question, we maybe haven't thought about certain things, and quite essentially that that needs to be brought forward. So it may be just to elaborate a bit on that one can bring forward from other sides of legislation, that it doesn't only have to fall under the environmental side. There is a bigger platform at hand here that we can utilize and try and mobilize to move legislation on in the right direction.
Right. Now, just on the 5G side, is there any truth behind the conspiracy theory that birds drop dead near these 5G towers?
I don't know.
I've seen videos where they've got all these birds that are lying dead near a 5G tower, and they're blaming the 5G tower.
Yeah, there's a lot of
conspiracy
evidence
theories
to say it is.
Yeah.
Well, I don't like to call it conspiracy theory, and until I call it unproven facts.
Yeah, there you go. That's good. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you both to just make a closing statement to everybody who's watching now and those who will watch it later, just regarding the subject and anything in particular you'd like to raise. And I think we'll just keep in the same sequence. Rob, if you want to start, and then I'll go over to Chloe, and then we'll wrap up the live stream. Over to you, Rob.
Sure thing. I think it's important for public to be aware of what is going on, particularly when it comes to holes in legislation, and understand that most problems in society are because of legislation. And but the public actually has the power to actually amend legislation and take care of societal problems through their own actions. And it's actually mandated within the Constitution and several laws surrounding that. So if you see a problem, you have the power to actually change your surroundings, change your environment by getting involved in your democracy. And it's called participative democracy, and we live in one. And got to remember that those so-called leaders are not leaders at all. They are public representatives. We, in fact, are supposed to lead and guide them to enact what we want to see in the future that we want to hold. And we need to do that. We can't sit back and once every 4 years make our mark, or once every 5 years make our mark. We have to be involved in the day-to-day decisions that happen at all levels of government. And it's really easy to do. It takes no effort. It's 5 minutes of your time a week, and you can do it. So please get involved. Get involved.
Right. Chloe, final word from you.
Thank you, Scott. I think maybe just in closing, also on the backside of Rob's statement there, is that I think a lot of us feel a bit maybe overwhelmed some days that there's just so many negative stories in the news, and where is this country going and what's happening, and it can be quite difficult to sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel when you're just sort of seeing negative things day in, day out. And it's not to say that they're not happening. They are happening. That's why it happens. You know, we see it so blatantly in our faces. And it's important to not let, or to try and not let those sort of negative incidences pull you down, rather, you know, to change a bit of your view that you can do something. And like Rob says, it's only 5 minutes a week. You know, you probably spend a longer time spent, you know, reading the news on the Facebook or wherever it might be, or in your newspaper that comes through to your house. You know, you'll spend a bit more time on that. So just to keep abreast, you know, we're also here to help public keep abreast of what is changing, and vice versa. Public can help us where we've maybe not seen something. And I think to expand the network, I mean, South Africans are always they're infamous for coming together when there is, you know, like these, when we have our heritage days and the Braai days, and it's that coming together. And Ubuntu in itself is as well, you know, coming together. I think to sort of continue and relay that through this as well, is that we are one big family across South Africa, and we need to stay together to be able to make changes going forward, so that we don't constantly get bogged down with negativity in our news. And maybe just on the other side of it is that with respect to the Fairview incident, it was truly tragic, and we don't want to take anything away from that. We would like to obviously channel that emotional support into something productive. So that's sort of where each and every one of our campaigns the seed of it comes from, is that it is an emotional matter, but we would like to see improvement at the end of it.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. I'll thank you properly in a second, guys. I just want to turn to the side chat and the moderators. Thanks, guys, for the fantastic job you've done tonight, looking after the people who are participating, and thank you for everybody who's joined us tonight. This is really a very, very important subject. I noticed in the side chat that Marlena said, now that our musicians are back at work and performing for an income, please let me know if you know of somebody who would like to go live and sing for us. And Jan van Riebeck was very, very cheeky. He said, nominate Scott Bolson. Now, I've got to tell you, Jan, a little secret. Remember my dog Bonsai? He used to follow me around. When I got in the shower and started singing, he would run out of the house barking madly and run to the furthest point from where I was singing. So I don't think that's going to work too well. All right. Now, Rob and Chloe, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on tonight. I will be sending you the link to this live stream in a few minutes, so if you want to share that and pass it around, I think it sort of sums up exactly what your organization is working on at the moment. And I wish you all the luck and best wishes with what you're doing, and keep up the great work. With that, I'm going to now shut down the live stream. Please take care, Chloe and Rob.
Thank you, and
very
same
much.
to you, Scott. We appreciate you having us on your show.
You're very, very welcome.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to say to everybody watching, please take care, guys. I know things aren't good in South Africa, but please just look after yourselves. And with that,